Good morning. Thank you all for being there. It's such a lovely weather outside. We should have the talks outside, actually. So let's see where we were. As you remember from yesterday, I have this architecture of the talks where we will now start dealing with various forms of variation in meaning. And yesterday we distinguished between a number of different forms of meaning that we will start having a look at: semasiological, conceptual, onomasiological, and formal onomasiological variation. What I'm presenting today, at least in in the first lecture, is a number of case studies on semasiological variation. And the studies are basically taken from this book, a book that was published in 1997 under the title Diachronic Prototype Semantics. The question for today, or at least for this lecture, is the following. If it is the case, as we suggested yesterday when we had a look at prototype theory, that variability is almost built into contemporary conceptions of linguistic meaning and categorization, then the question arises whether we can indeed demonstrate that variability when we look at the evolution of lexical categories. So we will take a diachronic perspective and try to see what the effect is of the structure of meaning, the prototype structure of meaning that we introduced yesterday. And to refresh your memory, semasiological variation has to do with prototypicality and polysemy. Conceptual onomasiological variation has to do with differences of construal, of choosing categories. And formal onomasiological variation has to do with synonymy. So now we are dealing with prototypicality and polysemy. And I will present two case studies. One on semasiological variation in a single meaning, and there will already be some onomasiology too in that talk. And then a second case study on semasiological variation in a polysemous lexical item when we deal with different meanings. And then there will be some conclusions. I would also want to point out that in general, in the talks today and then further talks in the following days, I will basically be presenting case studies. I will not be presenting an overall theoretical framework. Well, maybe in the talk this afternoon, but in general, it's more about description, how to describe the phenomena that interest us from this cognitive sociolinguistic point of view. So the first case study has to do with the evolution of neologism. So we're going to have a look at the way in which a new word, when it enters the language, evolves. What can we expect? What hypotheses can we formulate when we think of new words entering the language? And specifically, what kinds of hypotheses can we think of when we start from the idea that the internal semantic structure, the semasiological structure of the word, is or takes a prototype theoretical form? What can we expect? Well, what we should do then is to formulate our expectations for each of the different types of meaning that we have. So we have semasiological, conceptual onomasiological, formal onomasiological meaning. So what can we expect? What are the hypotheses, the expectations that we can formulate? Well, let's first take semasiology, and that's the aspect of meaning that we know best, because we had good examples yesterday when we looked at the fruit category. Okay, remember what we saw in the fruit category? We saw that you have a core area, a central area that is the basics or the basis of the category, and then you have more peripheral areas, margins if you wish, where the semantic features of the core area are not all at the same time present. Well, if that is what we find when we look at a lexical category at one point in time, synchronically, what exactly can we expect from a diachronic point of view? Well, probably from a diachronic point of view, what we can expect is that we first find the central area of the category, and that central area then develops into the periphery. Right? So what we saw yesterday from a synchronic point of view, one slice of time, one point in time, we are now transforming that, translating that into a hypothesis about the evolution of the category. So, to put it more formally, if prototypicality is a good model of the semasiological structure of categories, the semantic development of a new concept, will take the form of growing variations, growing modulations on the initial prototypical core. And we'll try to prove that. So we'll have a look at a case study to see whether this is indeed what happens when we follow the evolution of a word. Now, what can we expect with regard to conceptual onomasiology? Conceptual onomasiology, remember, that's the phenomenon in which we deal with categorical choices. Well, what we can expect is that if a new concept that enters a language or a culture or whatever is successful, then the success of that category and the fact that people want to use it more and more, the success of that category will become apparent in what we will call the entrenchment of the category, the growing entrenchment of the category. And what I mean by entrenchment, I will give you a more formal definition in a few moments, but what I mean by entrenchment is the salience of the category. Now, we talked about salience, and salience is a frequency effect. Okay? Salience is the recognition that in the structure of categories, some elements are more important than others. And from a semasiological point of view, that's easy. If we think of prototype theory, we can say, okay, the core area is more important. How does that show up? Well, if we ask people to name certain types of fruit, for instance, then the kinds of fruit that are in the middle of the category, in the center of the category, will be named more easily than the peripheral ones, like perhaps the coconut. That was our peripheral example yesterday. So salience, semasiological salience has to do with these prototypes effect. But what is onomasiological salience? Well, onomasiological salience is a preference for a certain choice in the onomasiological variation, among the onomasiological alternatives that you have. So the growing conceptual onomasiological salience of a category will mean that that category becomes, to put it simply, fashionable. That if you have the choice between categories A, B, and C, then the most salient one is the one, let's say that it is A, then the most salient one is the one that is the preferred choice. Okay? Again, we'll try to show how we can measure that, how we can establish that kind of conceptual salience. And then we have formal onomasiology. That's where we deal with synonymy. But specifically also, we've said that, specifically also with synonymy that has a lectal background, where the synonymy links up with the variation between different dialects or regiolects or sociolinguistic registers or whatever. So from that point of view, from the formal onomasiological point of view, we'll want to have a look if there are any synonymous expressions for this new category, this neologism that we're looking at. And if the choice, so the further step is then to see whether the choice between those formal synonyms is determined by lectal factors, by factors that have to do with the sociolinguistic variation in the language. Okay, so what's the example going to be? Well, the example is a clothing term, namely the term legging. You all know about leggings, probably. If you don't, I'll give you a picture in a moment, but you probably know what leggings are. Now, leggings are, or were, let me say were, quite fashionable in the first half of the 1990s. And then they sort of disappeared, they became less fashionable, and they're coming back at the moment. Now, what we did in this study is to have a look at the evolution of the concept legging during 5 years, from 1988 to 1992, which was the period when it was first introduced in at least in Western fashion, and it became very fashionable in those days. And how did we study our leggings? Well, we had a look at magazines, fashion magazines, and regular magazines. Why? Well, you have the pictures there. You don't only have the name, but you also have pictures, and you can use the pictures to get a description of the objects that you see, of the items of clothing that you see. Because what we're interested in, when we do this from a prototype theoretical point of view, what we're interested in is things like how much variation is there in the concept legging. What, for instance, does it mean that a legging needs to have, or maybe does not need to have, a certain length? Is it important for a legging to be long or not? That's the kind of empirical approach to the determination of the features, the descriptive features of leggings or any object that you want from a prototype theoretical point of view. So that's one thing. That's where the material comes from. We looked at a corpus of magazines. And on top of that, because we're also interested in sociolinguistic variation, we chose the magazines in such a way that we had magazines both from Netherlandic Dutch and Belgian Dutch. Now, a bit of background here, and I will have to say some more about the background later on. Dutch is spoken in Holland, in the Netherlands, and that's the main country where Dutch is spoken, but Dutch is also spoken in the north of Belgium, in the northern part of Belgium. The southern part of Belgium speaks French, okay? The northern part of Belgium speaks Dutch, or as it is sometimes called, Flemish. Okay? But basically, making a distinction between Dutch and Flemish is not very insightful. It's better to talk about two varieties of Dutch. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm distinguishing Netherlandic Dutch, that's the Dutch that is spoken in Holland, and Belgian Dutch, that's the Dutch that you find in Belgium. And there are some differences between the two. And I may have time later on to say a bit more about the differences. So our question here was, from the sociolinguistic point of view, are there any differences in the way a word legging is used in Holland, in the Netherlands, and the way it's used in Dutch-speaking Belgium? And how did we go about this? Well, for each of the pictures that we found in the magazines, we built up a referential description, but a description with features, if you wish. So we translated the pictures into features. I'll tell you in a moment how that works. And then we have a database, okay? And then we started analyzing the database from a quantitative perspective. So we used 6 dimensions to describe all the items of leggings that we found. Oh yes, I should also mention that the material is not restricted to legging. This was a study in which we looked at various items of clothing. So we looked at jackets and trousers in general, and shirts and T-shirts and so on. So it's not restricted to leggings, But I'm going to show you only the results that we got for the legging category. So what's this featural description? Oh yes, so this is the legging, right? In case you're not familiar, this type of garment. And so how do we describe items like this? Well, the description is similar to what we did yesterday for a category like fruit. Remember that we thought of features, of characteristics that might be useful for determining and describing types of fruit. Well, in this case, you can think of these characteristics as features that might be interesting for describing trousers in general, different types of trousers, legging types of trousers, jeans, and so on. And the featural, so what we do here is we have featural dimensions, and then we have values on those dimensions. So the dimensions are the length of the trousers, the width, whether they have a crease or not, the material that they are made of, the function, and the function in this case means, is it worn as a final layer of clothing or not? So a final layer, then there's nothing on top of it, right? For instance, these days when you wear leggings, very often you might want to wear skirts on top of the legging. At least that's what they do in the West. In the 1990s, that was not the case. Leggings were then simply worn as trousers, with nothing else on top of the leggings. And then sex obviously has to do with the question whether it's worn by a man or a woman. So those are the dimensions, and then you have the values on the dimension. For instance, for length, the value 3 would be as long as the ankles, 2 would be slightly shorter, and 1 would be just under the knee. So then you get the different types of length. Then width, value 1 means tight fitting. For crease, value 1 means no crease. Value 0 would be with a crease, and so on. So, and then the typical legging has the features and has the featural description 31111F, which then means it's long, it's tight fitting, it doesn't have a crease, it's made of finely woven elastic material, it's worn as an upper garment, and it's worn by a woman. Okay? So those are the descriptive features that we'll have a look at. Oh, actually, I will leave out the reference to crease, because if I include that, the pictures will be, the representations get too complicated. So what can we do with these features? Well, we can do exactly the same thing as what we did yesterday with a category like fruit. Remember that we drew the boxes to see how the various features occurred, and then we can put items in there. So that's also what we will do here. We'll have a representation of the semasiological range of a category as a cluster of overlapping subsets. Okay? So that is, if you wish, from a more theoretical point of view, you could call this a family resemblance representation. Okay? Family resemblance is one of the terms that we use to describe prototype effects, because the various instances of a category have a family resemblance. They don't all share the same features, but they share, like the members of a family, they share subsets of features. So we'll build up, like we did yesterday for fruit, we build up a family resemblance representation of the semasiological range of application of the category legging. And then, and that's what's new for today compared to yesterday, then we have a look at the evolution of the category over the 5 years that we studied. And what we expect is to see a gradual expansion of the prototypical core. So from minimal, we will go from minimal to maximal variation away from the prototype. So this is what the representation looks like for the first year, for 1988. So you can see that it works the same way as what we did for fruit. You have the boxes. The boxes represent a certain feature. And where the boxes overlap, that simply means that the features co-occur. Now, what is different here from what we did yesterday is that we have numbers. Yesterday we used pictures for the apple and so on, for the types of fruit. Here we're using numbers. And what do the numbers represent? The numbers mention the frequency with which we found a certain type of legging. So clearly, the central type of legging, the 31111F case, that's the one in the middle. And in 1988, so this is the picture for 1988, we found 14 cases of that central application. And we found 3 cases of a type of legging that is slightly different, specifically in the sense that it is slightly wider, because it does not have the feature W is 1. That box. Maybe I should point this out to you. So this box here does not apply to those cases. So we found 3 cases with that feature missing, and we found 1 case with another feature missing, the length feature specifically. So already in this case, in the very first year, you see that there is a prototype structure, but a minimal one. You have a core case, which is the most frequent one, and you have variations which are less frequent. Okay? So we have semasiological salience. But what interests us is how this category will develop. And what we expect then is basically 2 things. What we expect is, first, growing variation. The category will expand and other peripheral areas in the picture will be filled up. That's part of the flexibility that we expect in prototype concept. And on the other hand, what we also expect is to, in a sense, to counterbalance the flexibility. What we also expect is that the core area will remain the same. So what we expect for each successive year is more variation, but at the same time, stability in the center. So a combination of flexibility and stability. And that's typical for prototype concepts, right? It's typical for prototype concepts that, on the one hand, they are intrinsically flexible, because they don't have a very strict definition, for instance. But at the same time, they're also stable, because they have this central area that remains the same. And that gives you the basics of the category. So you can look at this as a kind of short film. So this is the first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year. Okay? So what you see in this final year is that the picture is filled up. You see much more variation than in the initial years. But at the same time, the core area is still the most frequent one. The one in the center is still the most frequent one. And if you look at the frequencies here, what you get, it's almost like an onion, right? You have the center of the onion, and that's where you have the highest frequencies. And then you go to a following layer, and there you still have high frequencies, but less than in the center. And then you go one step further, and there you get the really peripheral cases that appear only incidentally or only once. So let me go back again, back in time, and then you can see how the category shrinks to its original size. Okay, so this is a very nice illustration of what we expected to see. We said, okay, semasiological variation, if you look at it from the synchronic point of view, what you see is this sort of thing, a center, and the center is the most salient thing, and then you have peripheries. So what we expect diachronically when we look at evolution in time is stability in the center and variation in the periphery. Again, like that. Okay, that's another one. So what we can conclude then is that on the one hand, yes, we can find some sort of definition for legging. We can say legging is a tight-fitting, elastic, long kind of trousers for women. That's the definition of the center of legging, of the prototype of legging. But the word is used loosely, and sometimes leggings are less tight-fitting, sometimes they are a bit shorter, and so on. And the way in which the word is used loosely has these two features. New applications take the form of covariation along different dimensions. And that is to say, you have these sets of features, and it's by picking out subsets of the basic set of features that you get your variation. I also want to point out, but that's a more technical thing that I don't want to say too much about, some of the dimensions are continuous rather than binary or categorical ones. That's to say, if you think of the length of a category, we use three or four values, but of course length is something continuous. If you measure it in centimeters, you get lots and lots of categories. So the dimensions, the descriptive dimensions, sometimes have to be simplified to make or to get at the kind of representation that we had. But that's just a technical footnote, if you wish. And that's the most important thing for this lecture. If we consider those applications in time, we can see that novelties, innovations, take the form of a gradual expansion of the prototypical core. So the variability that we saw from a synchronic point of view has diachronic consequences and is corroborated, is affirmed when we look at evolutions. But that, of course, so what we've seen so far is only the semasiological thing, the semasiological perspective. Oh yes, there's one more thing I want to say. What we obviously also see in these pictures is the success of the category. We see that it is a fashionable thing, because in 5 years' time, the frequency of legging increases from under 20 to some 300 or more cases. Right? So that is, if you wish, the cultural aspect of things, or the evolution of fashion, if you would want to put it that way. We see that the category in question is successful. And that's important for our conceptual onomasiological point of view, because what we want to do there is to ask the question, okay, we now have this idea of semasiological salience. That's the existence of central cases in the structure of a category. But again, what's onomasiological salience? Onomasiological salience has to do with choices and preferred choices. So if we extrapolate the semasiological notion of salience, namely prototypicality, to an onomasiological domain, what would we want to have a look at? Well, we want to have a look at a cognitive preference for choosing one category rather than another as the name of a given referent or a set of referents. And how could you measure that? Well, let's do a very simple thought experiment. Imagine that I show to you, imagine that you're standing in front of your wardrobe, and you have a pair of jeans hanging there. How will you name them? If you're going to ask someone, what shall I wear? What would you say? You would probably talk about a pair of jeans. But that's not the only choice you have. You could also simply talk about a pair of trousers. Right? So you have onomasiological choices, but there's also a preferred choice. In this case, the preferred choice would be for jeans. For other kinds of trousers, more regular trousers perhaps, more less specific trousers, you would simply say trousers. So that's onomasiological salience. That's choosing one category rather than the other, or choosing one category more frequently rather than the other. So if you have that intuition, if you see that informally, that is the way in which onomasiological salience would work, you have something that you can categorize, but there is a preferred form of categorization. Okay? If you have that in mind, then we can give a slightly more technical definition of onomasiological salience or entrenchment, okay? Namely as follows. Technically speaking, onomasiological salience is the proportion of the frequency of the category name or names over the frequency of the category reference. What does this mean? Well, here we can do the thought experiment. Let's suppose now that, let's say that we are 100 people here, and I'm showing you a pair of jeans, and I'm asking you to write down the name. I'm not saying a name. I'm not using a name. I'm saying, what is this? Okay, I'm showing a pair of jeans now. You can see that. Okay. And I'm asking you, what is this? And you're writing it down. And probably 85% of you will write down a pair of jeans. And maybe 15% of you will write down a pair of trousers. Okay? This is just, I'm making this up, but you can imagine how it goes. We have frequencies then. Okay? We have a frequency of category reference. That is, I've shown 100 times, so to speak, a pair of jeans to you. I've shown an object to you 100 times for each of you individually. That's the frequency of the category reference. There were 100 objects to be named. Well, each of you separately named one object, but you're 100. So I'm saying 100 objects were to be named. That's frequency of category reference. And then you named the thing with a certain category. You chose a certain category, and if you chose jeans, that gives us the frequency. So the 85 among you who chose jeans in this fictitious experiment, the 85% of you who chose jeans, that gives us the frequency of the category names. So, or to put it more simplistically, it's about comparing one categorical choice to the alternatives for the same thing. Is that clear? Well, as you can understand, with the type of materials that we had for this clothing study, we can do this calculation. We can perform the calculation not on the basis of fictitious experiments, but on the basis of real data. And what do we expect? Well, what we expect is that, given the fact that we know, we saw it in the semasiological analysis, we also know that from experience, let's say, we know that legging was a fashionable category. People started wearing it more and more. So you can imagine that the category became more salient in people's minds. And we expect that that growing salience will be reflected in a growing entrenchment value. So if we perform this calculation for each successive year of this 5-year period, we expect the entrenchment of legging to rise. Now you could ask yourself, yes, but what about the other names? You've given us the material for legging, but where do you get the other names? Well, there, of course, it's important, as I said a few moments ago, that we did not only study legging, but we studied, for instance, or let me put it that way, we studied the whole field of clothing terms, and certainly all trousers. So if we have a thing that is a kind of trousers and that is not called legging, but that might have been called legging, we would know. So if we have something that has the 31111F feature, or featural description, and it's not called legging, then we can retrieve that from the database. It's easy to find in the database that in that case it would just be called not legging, but it would be called trousers or whatever, or elastic trousers or something like that. Okay? So that's how we get the frequency of the category referent, and that's how we can get the alternative names and then the category names. So let's have a look at oh yes, this is just applying it. So what are the names for the category legging? The names that specifically talk about legging and not about trousers in general and so on. Well, we have legging in the singular. We have leggings in the plural. But we also have a term of French origin. So legging in Dutch was a loan from English. That will be clear. But we also have a loan from French, caleçon. So if we look at the names that identify legging specifically, we get legging, leggings, caleçon. And we take the frequency of those together, and that's the frequency with which the concept legging is identified by a name that is specific for the concept legging. And then there are, of course, all other terms, so that's where we have a look at the frequency of all reference of legging, leggings, caleçon, even when they are not named by these specific names. Think of it simply as cases in which they are called trousers rather than just leggings. Okay. And then we do the calculations, and so here you get the results. Okay, let's have a look at the first column, or the 1988 column. We find 52 cases of things that might have been called legging, but only 18 of them are actually called legging. And those 18, obviously you will understand that, those 18 are these 18, right? The ones that we saw before. So 18 cases out of a possible total of 52 are called legging. So the entrenchment value is simply 18 divided by 52. That's 34%. And what we can see then, if we follow the evolution over these 5 years, is that the entrenchment value, as we predicted, or at least as we expected, grows from 34% to roughly 80%. So again, we get an indication of this growing success, fashionability of the category legging. And then there's another thing that we want to have a look at, formal onomasiology. If we look at the various names for the specific category legging, and we already know what the names are, okay, legging, leggings, caleçon. Do we find any lectal differences? Do we find sociolinguistic variation in the names of the leggings? Well, we do. And to keep it fairly simple, I will compare, this is the comparison, I will compare the term of French origin, caleçon, with the two variants of the English form, legging, singular, and then leggings, plural. So we're comparing them for the B, that's Belgian Dutch, and the NL, that's Netherlandic Dutch. And again, we're comparing them for 5 years. Now, there is one difficulty here. No, let me mention that in a moment. So first, what we get are two columns for each of the two countries, for each of the two national varieties of Dutch. We get two columns, and we calculate the percentage of the two forms. Let's now say the two forms, the French one and the English one, in the two countries. So if we take, for instance, 1990, in the Belgian material, you can see that almost 97% is represented by the French term, and only 3% is taken up by the English term. If you take the Dutch materials for 1990, you can see that 100% is taken up by the English term or English terms. You can also see, if you look at the first row, that we don't have any material yet for Holland, from the Netherlands, in the first year, which might inspire the conclusion that the Dutch are not as fashionable as the Belgians, but that's more a cultural conclusion than a linguistic one. It could also simply be an effect of the way we collected the materials. More importantly, if you look at the right-hand side of the figure, you will see that there is hardly any variation in the Netherlands. It's almost always, except for one case in 1991, it's almost always leggings. It's always the English term. On the other hand, if you look at the Belgian materials, you see a very interesting pattern. Because what you see is that it starts off with the French term, caleçon, 100%, but then you see a growing presence of the English alternative. So there is competition in Belgian Dutch. There's no competition in Netherlandic Dutch. Can we explain that? So first, this is clearly a case of formal onomasiological variation. We compare the frequencies of synonyms of caleçon and leggings, and we see that the distribution, the frequency distribution of the synonyms is influenced by lectal factors, by sociolinguistic factors. In this case, the difference between Netherlandic Dutch and Belgian Dutch. The question is also, of course, can we explain the differences? Why would this specific pattern occur? Why could it? How can it be that the presence of English in Belgian Dutch is less than the presence, is at least initially much less than the presence of English in Netherlandic Dutch, and that and at the same time that you can see that there is a growing influence of English. Well, to explain that, it's fairly easy to explain, but you need to know something about the background of Dutch in Belgium. And in the following sense, the language of culture in Belgium used to be French. We had Netherlandic dialects, so Dutch dialects, but the standard language, in at least, let's say, in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, used to be French all over Belgium, not just in the French-speaking part of Belgium, but also in the northern Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. Now, in the course of the 20th century, Dutch was, or Dutch developed into the standard language of the northern part of Belgium. But the influence of French is still there. So you get a double characteristic, if you wish, in the make-up of Belgian Dutch. On the one hand, it's influenced by the presence of French in the Belgian context. On the other hand, it has an orientation towards Netherlandic Dutch, because when people started using Dutch in Flanders, in the northern part of Belgium, as a standard language, they asked themselves, well, okay, but what does the standard Dutch language look like? And there was a standard Dutch language in the Netherlands, so they took over the existing standard Dutch language from the Netherlands. So you get two tendencies, two conflicting tendencies, and this is where you see how they conflict. You get a tendency to follow the Netherlands, and that leads, in this case, to a growing influence of English. On the other hand, you still have the presence, the cultural presence of French, and that leads to the initial choice for caleçon. Okay, this is what I've just explained. Okay, so what we've seen now is an example of semasiological variation in time, semasiological variation with already some illustration of onomasiological effects. But as I said yesterday, we've so far restricted our discussion to semasiological variation within a single concept, within a single meaning. Right? There's only one kind of legging. There's only one concept legging. But many lexical concepts, most lexical concepts, do not have a single meaning. They have various meanings. They are polysemous. So we should also ask the question, what happens when we look at polysemy? Do we get the same effects when we look at polysemous categories? Do we get the same structures? Do we get things like prototypicality when we look at semasiological variation in a polysemous category, and when we look at a polysemous category through time, do we get the same type of expansion that we saw in our leggings example? Well, we do. And to give you an example, I will have a brief look. I'm not going to go into the details because that would mean telling you way too much about the history of Dutch and so on. But I'll have a brief look at the historical evolution of one Dutch verb, the verb tuimelen, basically to tumble. It's the same root as English, to tumble. And instead of looking at 5 years, we'll now have a look at 4 centuries from the 16th to the 19th century. And instead of looking at one meaning, we'll have a look at 9 different meanings or senses. So what I'm going to do now first is to give you a very brief overview of the 9 senses, the 9 meanings. I'll do that by giving a definition, or at least a semantic gloss, presenting an example, and then I'll present, and also for each of the 9 senses, I will indicate during which period we can find it in the materials. I could explain a lot to you about about the question where the materials come from, but let's say that this is from a historical corpus of Dutch, okay? To keep it fairly simple. So the first meaning is what you would describe in English as to make somersaults, to go head over heels. So basically this thing, okay? What children might do, for instance, or what in more refined ways what people doing gymnastics might do. Or what you would also do when you swim and you dive and you do it like that. That's also this movement. Okay, we find that, oh yes, that's something I have to explain. So when you see 16a there, that means first half of the 16th century. That's when we first find in this material at least, when we first find the examples, and we find them in this case up to the second half of the 19th century. So that's 19b. So this is a meaning. If you see that from 16a to 19b, then it basically means this meaning is represented over the entire timeline that we are looking at in this case. And this is the central meaning. Well, let me not give you the Dutch example, but to briefly read the English translation. Uilenspiegel, that's a name, was very adventurous as a child. So when he was a baby lying in the cradle, he tumbled on the pillow and the blankets and put his behind in the air. Okay? This thing again. So that's the central reading, in fact. Then you get another reading, to fall down, 16b to 19b. An example, so this is about the siege of a city. As soon as the besiegers heard a noise, they immediately thought that the inhabitants of Ghent rushed out to smite them. That's why they sometimes ran away, tumbled one over the other. That's not a deliberate play like in the previous example, but it's falling one over the other. Fell into ditches and so on. Then you get a meaning to whirl down, to fall with a whirling movement. So this is someone, in the example, it's someone tumbling from a ship. The sailor, holding his hand imprudently before the mouth of a cannon, got wounded so severely that he tumbled down from the ship. You can see the similarity. It's a kind of turning movement, but in this case it's a combination of turning and going down. Then you also have this whirl meaning, but without the notion of falling. This is, for instance, in this example, this is what they use when they talk about the movement of dolphins. Dolphins that tumble in the water, that make these whirling movements. So then, if you like, we will sing taking turns, so that even the local river god in his streaming palace will be disturbed and will rise from the waves with his courtiers on tumbling dolphins. Making those movements. And then we get figurative readings, like, so the various passions toss, tumble, and burn. These are not animate beings, but passions. So this is what you will recognize as a metaphor. The whirling movement that we have in the literal readings is now used metaphorically to talk about emotions. Oh, and notice that this is a type of meaning that we only find in a fairly restricted period. We have a few examples in the second half of the 18th century, but we have no more materials than that. Another figurative meaning is to fall down figuratively. The government would have tumbled, right? The government would have fallen, but in actual fact, and so on. And then another literal meaning, and this is referring not to animate beings but to objects, where it means to pivot, to turn around an axis, like some windows might do. Okay? So the use of cast iron window frames has increased greatly in recent times. Usually they are used as fixed windows with a part that swings or tumbles open. Okay? And then, I think this is oh no, it's not the final one. Then there's a meaning that we will recognize as metonymical. Let me first read the example. Hiccuping, vomiting, tumbling over its hind legs, re-establishing its balance on its front legs, the bull staggers on. This is describing a bullfight, actually. And the bull is about to fall. He's not yet falling, but he's about to fall. So he's staggering, he's swaying, but not yet falling. So this is metonymical in the sense that it is the beginning of falling, but not yet the falling itself. To almost fall down, if you wish. And then, yeah, that's the final one. There is another rather infrequent figurative instance where you have the notion of involuntarily reaching a certain position. Ever again, I tumbled from one subject into the other. In English, in contemporary English, you would probably say, I stumbled from one subject into the other. Okay, so we have these meanings. Of course, you would need to familiarize yourself more with them to get a real feeling for the category. But let's not do that. That would take too much time. But let's rather see as how we at the question, how can we represent the evolution of this category, and do we find effects that are similar to what we found when we looked at legging, when we looked at a single concept. So here you have different readings. Different readings, and as you can see, we have a central case, the making somersaults case, and then you get different extensions. You get extensions based on literal similarity, going to falling down, to whirling down, to pivoting. You get metaphorical extensions based on metaphorical similarity, falling down figuratively, etc. And you get a metonymical extension. So that's the type of thing that you really expect in lexical categories, in polysemous lexical categories. Central cases that are expanded by means of the traditional mechanisms of semantic change, right? Metaphor, metonymy, and some others, but in this case specifically metaphor and metonymy. But if we represent that, if we try to represent that in a graphical way, what do we get? Well, we could do that in various. Oh yes, one intermediate step I want to take is that when we represent these things, we might also want to use a featural description to analyze the meanings in terms of components in the way we did with leggings and with fruit. And we can actually do that here, and this is an example. I would say that, so to the left you get the various readings, somersaults, fall down, whirl freely, pivot. And then you get features like the following: rolling round one's axis, touching the ground or not, with a downward movement or without necessarily exhibiting a downward movement, and doing it deliberately or not. So we can indeed give a componential description of these categories, of these senses, in the way we did for fruit and legging. But there's a restriction. If you use these features, they would apply only to the literal senses. If you add the metaphorical senses or the metonymical senses, you could not include them in the same chart, in the same table, because this table has to do with the features that determine, that structure, the literal similarity between a subset of the senses, but not all the senses. For other senses, for the metaphorical and the metonymical one, you need other things. You need precisely to identify them as metaphors and metonymies. So you can try that. You can try to bring in the metonymical, the metonymical sense of to sway, to stagger in this set of features, and you will notice that it will not give you a good definition of that metonymical reading. The best thing there is to identify it as a metonymy. So that's a major difference between, it's important to keep that or to see that. This is a major difference between the analysis of single meanings and the analysis of polysemy. When you do the analysis of single meanings, you could probably restrict it, or you could probably do with just the family resemblance analysis, right? The family resemblance analysis with the features or with the overlapping sets. But once you go for really polysemous category, it's like getting into another dimension, because you get other mechanisms of extension. When you have, on top of family resemblances, you get things like metaphor and metonymy. And obviously, your representational methods will have to be adapted to that. Okay? On top of the family resemblances that we can represent with these tables or with the overlapping sets representation, we will need to add something else. We will need to add lines saying, from this meaning to that, you get a metaphorical link. Or for that meaning to that, you get a metonymical link. So the representation will become slightly more complicated, because we have to add another level of representation. Okay, there's another thing that we might want to add here, or that we need to represent, and that's the timeline. So let's try to represent the evolution of the category. And I will, just to show you that you can do this in various ways, I'll do this in 3 ways, just briefly, in 3 different ways. Well, they all have their advantages and disadvantages, but I won't dwell on that. The type that we already saw, but as I mentioned a moment ago, we will have to expand that with a few other representations. And then there's a third approach, a global linear approach, that gives us a very good idea of how the category evolves through time. So let's begin with the central case, make somersaults, and that develops into fall down. Oh, by the way, the successive steps I'm taking here are the steps that are in the diachrony of the material, right? So we see that certain things happen to the category in different periods. So I'm following the periods. Make somersaults to fall down. Then in the first half of the 18th century, 2 more meanings are added. Then in the second half of the 18th, 1 more, and then in the second half of the 19th century, you get this. So here, if you build it up like that chronologically, you can see how the category expands. And that's, of course, what we wanted to see. We asked ourselves the question, is the kind of semasiological evolution that you get in a polysemous category, is that of the same expansive type as what you got in a single meaning? Well, it is. If you take, oh yes, I forgot 1 step. Here are some more. So let's get back. We begin in the center, and then chronologically we see the expansion of the category. It's of the same type as what we saw before. You begin with a core application, and the core application expands. Let me do this once more, like that, and then like that. Notice that we could add things to the representation. We can label the links. We can mention what kind of semantic extension we have there. So, for instance, from the initial one, from to make somersaults to fall down, that's a link of similarity, and I mean their literal similarity. And then I have red links, which are metaphorical extensions, and there's 1 blue link for the metonymy. So if we have this type of representation, we can add information by labeling the links, by identifying the type of semantic extension, by identifying the process that leads from one meaning to the other. Okay. So this is one kind of representation, but it's a representation that has a certain disadvantage, because if you have a look at the literal meanings, the ones that are not metaphorical or metonymic, you don't get a really good insight into the relation between the metonymic readings, because what you don't get is this information, the information about the features that connect the literal meanings. You don't get the information about the descriptive cluster, the family resemblance, let's call it that way. You don't get the information about the family resemblance. So once we're here, once we have this radial set representation, we can ask ourselves whether we can transform this into a family resemblance representation. And that's, of course, when we do that, we will get something even more similar to what we had with fruit and leggings, and specifically with leggings. Because we would get this, right? So the table that I've shown a moment ago can be transformed into this kind of picture. And then, of course, for the literal readings, not for the metaphorical or the metonymical ones, the family resemblance structure will be filled out like this, and then so on. But then we will, of course, also want to add the metonymies and the metaphors, and then we will have to use a different representation, like with lines like this. Okay, you might ask yourself the question, if you look at this filmic representation here. So we start with make somersaults, and then it's filled out like that, and then we get this world figuratively reading, but it disappears again. Why does it disappear? Well, this is a representation that builds up century after century, and we know that certain meanings don't subsist. They pop up and they disappear again. Okay? That's what you see in this type of representation. So it appears and then it disappears again and others appear. And this is the final stage. And notice that this is the difference with the representation we had a moment ago. Let me briefly go back. This representation is, if you wish, panchronic. Right? This is a representation of all chronological layers on top of each other. This is not the end result, because in the end result, some of those meanings would already have disappeared. This type of structuring that I have here, okay, wait a minute, that I have here, takes a different representation for each chronological period. So this is so now going back in time, this is the second half of the 19th century, first half of the 19th century, second half of 18th, first half of 18th, and so on. So here we have a different representation for each half century. And you could, of course, ask yourself the questions, yes, but wouldn't it be nice if we could bring all those chronological periods together in one representation, so that we could see, that we would not have six or eight or whatever different, 8 in this case, different representations, but just one in which we could see the evolution of the category over time. Well, that's the final representation that I want to show to you. So what we do here is we have the meanings to the right, and we have the centuries along the horizontal dimension, well, half centuries. And what we will now do is to indicate with dots which meaning appears in which period. And by drawing the lines, we can see how the category develops, and we can also see how certain meanings disappear again. So in the first half of the 16th century, we have this. In the second half of the 16th century, we get this. Yes, notice what the horizontal line simply means this meaning continues. The diagonal line means this is an evolution. A new meaning arises as an extension, as an expansion of an existing one. Right? That's the diagonal line. So we get one meaning that continues and a new meaning that emerges in the second half of the 16th century, and then it goes on. I will do this just quickly, like this, 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 this. Okay? So you can see how the category evolves, and you can also see clearly in this representation that certain meanings do not subsist in time. Like this one, it occurs only peripherally. It occurs once or a few times in this period, and then it disappears again. So again, let me go back in time to show you once more how this builds up. Right, so we begin with the prototypical sense, with the central case, and we can see how the category expands in various directions. So we can certainly conclude from this example that the things that we saw in our analysis of legging, so this gradual expansion of a category, that's the same thing, that's the same structure, the same picture that we find when we look at polysemous categories. It's not essentially different. The evolution of meaning within a single sense, within a single reading, or the evolution of meaning among different readings has the same structural characteristics. There's one difference, but we've mentioned that. The difference is that when you stay within one reading, it's basically family resemblances that structure the evolution. When you go to different meanings, other mechanisms of extension are added, specifically metaphor and metonymy. So, to conclude, contemporary models of semantic structure incorporate variability into the architecture of the categories, into the architecture of the semantics of the categories. And when we do diachronic analysis of the type that I've illustrated with my two case studies, either on a short range or on a long range, we had an example of both. So when we do diachronic analysis, we can really corroborate the importance of that variability, and we can even do that both semasiologically and onomasiologically. A second conclusion is, as I said a moment ago, the characteristics of the variation are largely similar from a monosemic and a polysemic perspective, because in both cases we find gradual expansions of dominant readings and a multidimensional network of relations among the readings. And then what interests us specifically from the cognitive sociolinguistic point of view, we get clear indications in our examples that social factors play an important role in this multidimensional structure of the variation. For instance, that was a quite clear example of that. When we look at the evolution of legging, well, the evolution that we find is clearly related to the evolution of fashion, to the fashionable success of leggings in the period that we considered. That's a social factor. And what we will be doing in the talk this afternoon is to try to be a bit more theoretical about those sociological, social factors in the evolution of such categories and in the structure of the variability. But that's for this afternoon. Thank you.